It started with a single message that cut through the noise of the world, short, shaky, and filled with fear. It wasn't sent from another planet or a faraway star. It came from Earth itself across the oceans, from a small island nation that had fallen into chaos. In just a few minutes, everything that made that island beautiful was destroyed. The Earth shook so hard that buildings split in half. Roads cracked open like dry skin. The city's lights went out one by one as power stations collapsed. People ran into the streets calling for their loved ones, but the air was filled with dust and the sound of breaking walls. Then came the storms. Huge waves crashed against the coast, dragging cars, trees, and houses into the sea. The rain poured like it wanted to wash everything away. In some places, the water rose higher than rooftops. Families climbed whatever they could. The remains of buildings, tall trees, even floating debris, trying to survive one more hour. Hospitals were overflowing. Doctors worked with flashlights, using whatever supplies they had left. Children cried for parents who never came back. Power lines were down and phones stopped working. The internet went dark. For the people trapped there, it felt like the world had ended. And for a while, the rest of the world only watched. News channels showed bits and pieces, grainy footage of floods, broken bridges, and people waving from rooftops. But nobody knew how bad it really was. The island was cut off from the world. Then a signal appeared. A short message somehow made it through the broken systems and into the global emergency network. It wasn't long, just a few words, but they carried the weight of millions of lives. "We cannot save ourselves. Please, anyone, help us." The words echoed across continents. In control rooms, in military bases, in relief centers, screens lit up with the same message. Operators froze. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then calls started. Reports came in. Satellites confirmed the disaster. The situation was worse than anyone imagined. Entire cities had vanished beneath water and rubble. In the capital city of one of the world's major powers, a young technician read the message aloud to his commander. Around him, officers looked at each other, waiting for orders. The commander stood still for a moment, staring at the screen. Then he said quietly, "We can't wait for someone else. Get the fleet ready." The same thought spread across the world. Governments opened emergency channels. Civilian aid groups started collecting food, medicine, and tents. Air forces cleared their runways. Ships at sea changed their routes. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about saving lives. People from countries that had never spoken before began coordinating. Naval fleets from opposite sides of the world plotted the fastest paths through the ocean. Cargo planes were loaded with generators, medical units, and rescue teams. Soldiers trained for war now packed supplies instead of weapons. News spread fast. Social media filled with messages of hope and fear. Volunteers gathered at ports, airports, and warehouses, helping strangers load boxes marked relief aid. Some wrote notes and placed them inside the boxes, small words of comfort for whoever might find them on the other side. As night fell, the island lay in darkness. Fires burned in the ruins where fuel tanks had burst. The sea glowed faintly under the moonlight, carrying pieces of homes and memories away. People huddled together on higher ground, hungry, cold, and terrified. Some had been waiting for help for 2 days already. Then, in the quiet between thunder and waves, a small sound broke the silence, a faint rumble in the distance. At first, no one believed it. But as the sound grew louder, people began to look toward the horizon. Through the rain, faint lights flickered, dozens of them blinking in formation. But that moment hadn't happened yet. For now, all that existed was the message, the desperate call for help, floating through cables, satellites, and radio waves, reaching people who had the power to do something. In living rooms around the world, people watched the news and felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: unity. The disaster didn't belong to one country. It belonged to all of humanity. On one ship docked thousands of miles away, a captain received his orders. His crew had been preparing for months for a routine mission, but now they were being sent into chaos. He gathered his men and women on deck and told them they asked for help, and were going to answer. In hospitals, doctors packed portable kits and volunteered to go. Engineers left their offices and joined emergency response teams. Pilots agreed to fly through dangerous weather zones. It didn't matter who they were or where they came from. Everyone wanted to help. That single plea had awakened something deep inside people, the understanding that no one survives alone. Humanity, for all its flaws and divisions, still had the power to care, to act, to unite. Back on the island, as the rain finally slowed, a group of survivors gathered around a broken radio. Static filled the air. Then faintly they heard a human voice on the other end, calm, steady, promising that help was coming. Tears rolled down tired faces. For the first time in days, they dared to believe they might live through this. Across the world, engines roared to life. Helicopters lifted off, ships left their harbors, slicing through rough seas. Cargo planes rumbled down runways. Under stormy skies, the SOS had been heard, and humanity, the same species that often fought and divided itself, had decided to move as one. The message that began with fear had become something greater. It was no longer just a cry for help. It was a test of courage, of compassion, of what it truly meant to be human. And as the first rescue ships broke through the waves toward the destroyed island, one truth became clear to everyone watching. When one voice calls for help, the world must answer, and this time humanity did. Far away from the island, in a high-security command room filled with glowing screens and tense faces, the world's most powerful people sat together. It was not a normal meeting. It was an emergency unlike any before. The room buzzed with voices, leaders, generals, relief directors, scientists, all trying to find a way to help millions of people trapped in disaster. The screens showed endless images of destruction, flooded cities, collapsed bridges, burning hospitals, people waving from rooftops. The earthquake and storms had hit so hard that entire regions were cut off. Roads were gone, airports underwater, communication towers shattered. Every plan they tried ended with the same problem. They couldn't reach the survivors in time. Civilian aid teams were already trying their best. Rescue helicopters had been launched, and small boats were searching for survivors. But the scale of the disaster was far beyond anything they could handle. Supplies weren't arriving fast enough. People were dying not from the earthquake, but from hunger, thirst, and disease. Every hour counted. Every delay cost lives. One relief officer stood up, his voice shaking. "We can't do this with small aid groups," he said. "We need something bigger, faster, something that can reach everywhere." The room fell silent. Everyone looked at each other, realizing the truth no one wanted to say out loud. Then an older commander spoke, calm but firm. "We need to deploy the fleet." For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. Deploying the fleet wasn't a small decision. It meant mobilizing the largest naval and air assets on Earth. Ships, planes, personnel, resources, everything. It was the kind of operation normally done during wars, not disasters. But this time the enemy wasn't another nation. The enemy was time, the commander continued, his voice steady. Not a fleet of war, a fleet of mercy. Around the room, heads began to nod. The idea made sense. The fastest, most powerful vessels on the planet were not just built for battle. They could carry hospitals, power generators, food, water, and medical teams. Aircraft carriers could be transformed into floating relief bases. Cargo planes could drop supplies to places no boat could reach. Submarines could bring clean water systems. Every piece of military machinery could become a tool to save lives instead of taking them. The decision spread quickly. Calls went out to every major naval base in the world. Captains, engineers, pilots, and doctors received their orders. Ships that once carried weapons began to load medicine and food. Aircraft carriers cleared their decks for helicopters and medical tents. Cargo planes filled their bellies with blankets, baby formula, and clean water filters. In just hours, the world's militaries began turning into something humanity had never seen before: a global rescue force. Across continents, command centers lit up. The United Nations, Red Cross, and dozens of relief agencies joined forces. It didn't matter what flag anyone served under. Politics and rivalries vanished. The mission was clear: save as many lives as possible. In one corner of the room, a young coordinator whispered, "Is this really happening?" Everyone together. The general smiled faintly. "It's about time," he said. Satellite feeds showed fleets mobilizing from every ocean. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, ships from Europe, Asia, and the Americas all heading toward the same coordinates, the shattered island. The Air Force's coordinated routes so no aircraft would collide. Commanders exchanged data in real time. Even nations that hadn't spoken in years began working side by side. It was chaos, but it was beautiful chaos. For once, humanity wasn't divided by borders or politics. It was united by compassion. In a coastal city, an old aircraft carrier was being refitted overnight. Workers and volunteers rushed to install hospital beds where fighter jets once sat. Doctors set up emergency wards. Electricians connected portable power grids. A large banner was hung across the deck. Operation Dawnlight, help for the island. In another country, massive cargo planes were lined up on the runway, their engines roaring one after another. Each one carried tons of supplies, food packets, tents, medicine, and clean water systems. Soldiers and civilians worked side by side, loading boxes, checking lists, and hugging each other before takeoff. In a quiet office, an old relief director watched the global map filling with hundreds of blinking dots, each dot a ship, plane, or rescue team moving toward the disaster. He wiped his eyes and said softly, This is what humanity should look like. The mission was no longer owned by any one nation. It belonged to the world. Journalists began calling it Earth's fleet. The name spread like wildfire, a symbol of hope, unity, and strength. Back in the command room, updates poured in. Fuel supplies secured, weather patterns monitored, communication lines restored between fleets. Every screen glowed with green signals. Ships launching, planes en route, hospitals preparing for incoming survivors. The leaders stood together, watching as decades of mistrust and politics vanished in a single cause. It wasn't about who led the operation. It was about why they were doing it. Humanity had been given a chance to prove it could rise above its divisions, and it did. Somewhere in the middle of the night, the main commander gave the final order. Activate global fleet coordination. Launch all units. Within minutes, the world's oceans came alive. Massive ships began cutting through the dark waves. Aircraft thundered through storm clouds. Radios crackled with life as crews checked in from every corner of the globe. For the first time in living memory, humanity moved as one heartbeat, millions of people working toward a single purpose. Doctors who had never met soldiers were now sharing plans. Scientists were using satellite data to predict safe landing zones. Pilots from rival air forces were flying side by side, delivering aid to the same coordinates. Even ordinary people joined the mission. Families donated supplies. Students raised funds online. Fishermen along the coast offered their small boats to carry relief closer to shore once the larger ships arrived. It was a sight no one thought possible. A world that usually argued and fought, suddenly united in compassion and purpose. From the window of the command room, one of the coordinators watched the sunrise spreading across the horizon. He turned to the others and said, "For the first time in my life, I'm proud of us and all of us." No one disagreed, because in that moment, the lines between nations blurred. Humanity remembered that it shared one sky, one ocean, and one fate. The fleet was no longer just a collection of ships and planes. It was a symbol of what people could do when they stopped asking who deserves help and started asking, how can we help? As the fleets moved toward the devastated island, carrying hope in every direction, one message was broadcast across all frequencies. A message that would later be remembered in history books. This is not the mission of one country. This is Earth's mission. And for the first time in decades, humanity truly acted as one. 3 days after the desperate message had gone out, the people on the broken island began to lose hope. They had survived the quake, the floods, and the hunger. But each new sunrise felt heavier than the last. Many had no strength left to stand. They waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the sea, praying for something, anything, to appear on the horizon. Then one morning, as the sun began to rise, someone shouted from the shore. Others looked up. Far out on the ocean, shapes were moving, dark, massive, and countless. At first, the survivors thought they were clouds or mountains. But as the light grew stronger, the truth became clear. The horizon was filled with ships, huge ships lined in formation, their gray hulls glinting in the sunlight. Helicopters hovered above them and planes circled in the sky. The sea that had brought destruction now carried salvation. People screamed, cried, and pointed toward the approaching fleet. Some fell to their knees in disbelief. After days of silence, the air filled with the sound of engines, the beating of rotors, and the rush of waves against steel. It was the sound of life returning. The first ship dropped anchor a few miles offshore. Then another. And another. In total, Dozens of vessels formed a line across the coast like a wall of protection. Their decks were crowded with activity, helicopters lifting off with crates of food, drones buzzing overhead to scan the ruined cities, boats being lowered into the water packed with medics, engineers and rescuers. From the beach, people waved frantically, shouting and crying. Children jumped up and down. Some even ran into the shallow water as if they could swim out to greet the ships. It felt like a miracle. Soon, helicopters began to land on makeshift clearings. The noise was deafening. Dust and debris flew everywhere, but no one cared. The first teams of rescuers stepped out, carrying medical kits, radios, and water bottles. They looked around at the destruction, the broken houses, the wounded, the silence of the dead, and immediately began their work. "Communications first," shouted one of the engineers. Within hours, satellite equipment was being set up. Cables stretched across the ground, connecting radios, laptops, and antennas. Generators hummed. For the first time since the disaster, voices from the outside world were heard. "This is Earth's Fleet Command. We have you. You are not alone." On another part of the island, doctors were setting up emergency hospitals under tents. They treated burns, fractures, infections, everything that days without medical care had made worse. A young nurse from a faraway country knelt in the mud beside an old woman, holding her hand as she cleaned her wounds. A surgeon worked for 20 hours straight without rest. Every time they saved someone, cheers broke out. Every time they lost someone, a moment of silence followed. Then they went back to work. The coordination was like nothing anyone had ever seen. Teams from different nations worked side by side without asking who was in charge. Soldiers helped carry food boxes. Civilians guided rescuers through flooded streets. Drones mapped the safest paths for supply drops. Every person there had one goal: save lives. A small child, barefoot and covered in dirt, stood on a piece of wreckage and waved at a helicopter landing nearby. The pilot waved back before taking off again to deliver more supplies. Soldiers who had been trained for battle now found themselves carrying children on their shoulders, comforting them and giving them water and biscuits. Some cried quietly behind their helmets when they saw how much suffering these people had endured. By nightfall, the beach was alive with lights. Flood lamps lit the wrecked coast like a new city. Ships glowed offshore, their decks shining with activity. Helicopters continued to come and go, their lights cutting through the darkness. Loudspeakers echoed with messages of hope. "Stay calm. Help is here. Food and medical aid are being delivered." One engineer stood on a hill holding up an antenna toward the sky. "We have signal," he shouted. Cheers erupted all around him. For the first time, the survivors could contact their loved ones abroad. People lined up to make short radio calls. Cries of joy echoed as voices from distant countries answered back. "We're safe. We're alive. Thank you." Above it all, on the tallest ship, flags of many nations fluttered together in the sea wind. Different colors, different emblems, but united in purpose. It wasn't about power or pride or who came first. It was about people helping people. It was about humanity remembering itself. In the middle of the chaos, an old fisherman who had lost everything sat on a broken wall watching the ships. A volunteer approached him with a bottle of water. The old man looked at the fleet and whispered, "They came." The volunteer smiled and nodded. "Yes, sir. They came for all of us." In one of the makeshift hospitals, a young doctor held a newborn baby delivered only hours earlier. The mother, weak but alive, smiled through her tears. "You saved us," she whispered. The doctor shook her head. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other." All around there were small moments like this, simple, human, beautiful. Soldiers sharing their meals with hungry families. Pilots sleeping on the ground beside their aircraft. Journalists putting down their cameras to carry water to the wounded. Every act of kindness built a bridge between people who had never met before, people from lands that once stood far apart. By the end of the second night, the operation had changed everything. Roads were being cleared, water systems repaired, and shelters built. The island, though scarred, began to breathe again. The smell of food replaced the smell of smoke. The sound of crying was joined by laughter, and on the third night, as the sea grew calm, the survivors gathered on the shore. They looked at the shining line of ships in the distance, massive, silent, and strong. Someone began to sing, others joined in. Soon the entire beach echoed with a song of gratitude and relief. The sound carried over the water to the ships where sailors paused to listen. For those who had come to help, It was impossible not to feel moved. Many of them had seen war, conflict, and death before, but nothing like this. Nothing so pure and powerful. They weren't heroes in that moment. They were simply human beings doing what had to be done. As dawn broke again, the sky turned gold and pink, and the fleet shimmered on the horizon like a promise kept. A new banner was raised on one of the ships, a white flag with blue letters that read, "We heard your call." And the people on the island whispered back through tears and smiles. The SOS was answered. It wasn't just rescue. It was a reminder that when the world chooses unity over indifference, miracles can happen. The fleet had brought more than food, medicine, and machines. It had brought hope, the kind that could rebuild not just cities, but faith in humanity itself. Days passed, then weeks. What began as an emergency rescue slowly grew into something far greater than anyone had imagined. The island, once silent and broken, now buzzed with life and movement. Helicopters flew back and forth carrying supplies. Boats moved through flooded streets like taxis, delivering food, water, and medicine. Tents covered the beaches, each one a small world of people helping people. The operation had become one of the biggest humanitarian efforts in modern history. At first, everything seemed impossible to manage. Thousands of workers, soldiers, doctors, and volunteers had come from every part of the world. There were so many languages, uniforms, and faces that it looked like the entire Earth had gathered in one place. And with that came chaos. Different aid groups had different plans. Some argued about where the food should go first or who needed the most help. There were too many needs and too little time. Disease began to spread in some areas where people were still crowded together. Medical teams worked around the clock to stop it, vaccinating thousands in a day, cleaning water systems, and setting up mobile clinics. The work was endless. No one slept properly. Every night the sound of helicopters filled the air, and every morning the lines for food grew longer. But despite the challenges, the coordination somehow held. Every person knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. When one group ran out of supplies, another stepped in to help. When a storm destroyed a field hospital, neighboring ships sent tents and equipment to rebuild it within hours. No one asked whose flag was flying or which government they belonged to. They just worked together. Even when tempers flared and mistakes happened, people reminded each other why they had come. "We're here to save lives," one doctor said after a long argument over logistics. His voice was tired but firm. "That's the only thing that matters," and everyone nodded. Every day brought new tests. There were food shortages when ships were delayed by rough weather. Fuel ran low. Sometimes communication lines went down and confusion spread. But with each obstacle, the teams grew stronger. They learned from failure, adjusted, and kept moving forward. And every success reminded them why they had come. One morning, a convoy of trucks rolled through the ruined streets carrying children who had been missing for weeks, rescued by search teams. People clapped and cheered as the trucks passed. Later that night, when the first school reopened under a large tent, the volunteers gathered to watch. The children sang a song of thanks. For many of the rescuers, it was the first time they had smiled in days. The fleet's presence didn't just save the island, it changed the world's heart. News channels everywhere broadcast images of soldiers carrying babies, engineers fixing water pumps, and doctors treating strangers under the same roof. People who had grown used to hearing stories of war and division were now watching a story of unity. In cities far away from the island, people began organizing their own small missions, sending clothes, raising money, and collecting supplies. Children wrote letters to the survivors, signing them with drawings of ships and hearts. One letter said simply, "The world didn't forget you." Countries that had once been rivals began to see each other differently. Their leaders spoke publicly about cooperation instead of competition. Old tensions softened. When one nation's cargo ship broke down at sea, another country's navy, once considered an enemy, came to tow it safely. On the decks of those ships, soldiers from opposing sides shared meals and stories. They realized they were not enemies at all, just people wearing different uniforms. A pilot from one country and a rescue diver from another became close friends after saving a group of children from a collapsed school. Later, when asked how they managed it, the diver said, "It wasn't about where we came from. It was about who needed us." Slowly, the entire world began to see itself reflected in that island. It was no longer just about one place recovering from disaster. It was about the idea that humanity could still come together, that compassion was stronger than politics. The operation continued for weeks. As systems improved and more survivors were rescued, the pace slowed slightly, but no one wanted to leave yet. People had found purpose here, something pure and meaningful. The soldiers who were used to orders and conflict now became saviors. They carried babies, rebuilt schools, and repaired fishing boats. One young Marine wrote in his journal, "I came here expecting to follow orders. I didn't know I'd end up holding a child who called me hero." Engineers stayed long after their shifts ended, helping rebuild homes from scraps. Doctors shared whatever medicine they had left. Even journalists who had come to report the story started volunteering, carrying water or comforting the injured. Each small act of kindness built something larger: trust. It became clear that humanity had remembered how powerful it could be when united by care instead of greed, by hope instead of fear. The island itself began to change. Markets reopened. People laughed again. Streets that had been covered in mud and ruin now echoed with music and the sound of rebuilding. Where despair once lived, determination took root. Everywhere you looked, there were stories of courage. A soldier who hadn't slept in 3 days kept working because he didn't want a single family to go hungry. A doctor performed surgeries by flashlight because the generators failed again. Volunteers waded through waist-deep water to bring medicine to those who couldn't reach the camps. And through it all, the fleet remained offshore, a silent guardian watching over them. The people of the island called it the Sea of Hope. At night, the lights from the ships glowed like stars on the water, reminding everyone that they were not alone. Reporters later wrote that this operation changed history. It wasn't the disaster that made the headlines anymore. It was the response. For the first time in decades, the world had united not for war, not for power, but for life. When the last rescue helicopter lifted off, carrying the final group of survivors, everyone watching from the ground began to cheer and wave. Many were crying, not from sadness, but from pride. They had seen what humanity could be when it acted with heart. One commander, standing on the deck of a ship, looked toward the island and said quietly, "We came to help them rebuild, but in truth, they rebuilt us." Because the operation had done more than rebuild a nation, it had rebuilt faith. It showed that no matter how divided the world might seem, there is still something deep within every person that responds to another's suffering. A simple truth that had been forgotten, now remembered. When the world looked back at the story, people didn't just see the tragedy. They saw unity, courage, and compassion. The island became a symbol of hope, proof that even after the darkest storms, humanity can rise together. And in the hearts of everyone who took part, one feeling remained clear and unshakable. Humanity had remembered what it could be when it acted as one. Months passed since the great disaster had struck the island, and slowly life began to return. The ruins that once stood as painful reminders of loss were replaced by new buildings, schools, and homes. The people didn't rebuild the island exactly as it was before, and they built it better, stronger, and smarter. Roads were wider, structures were more secure, and shelters were placed on higher ground. Every nail, every brick, carried a story of survival and gratitude. The harbor, once filled with debris and broken ships, now gleamed under the sunlight. Fishermen returned to cast their nets again. Children played near the docks, and the laughter that had vanished for months echoed across the waves. It was not just the sound of joy returning. It was the sound of hope being reborn. The scars of destruction still existed, but they no longer defined the people. Instead, they became symbols of endurance. At the heart of the harbor stood something new: a memorial. It was simple but powerful. A stone monument faced the ocean, exactly where the fleet had anchored during the darkest days. On its surface, carved in bold letters, were the words that everyone remembered: "When we cried for help, the world came." Below those words were smaller inscriptions written in dozens of languages: English, Japanese, Arabic, Urdu, French, Swahili, and many more. Each one said the same thing. The SOS was answered. Humanity sent the fleet. People from across the world came to visit that spot. Survivors brought flowers, aid workers stood silently in reflection, and visitors who had never seen the disaster still felt the weight of what had happened. Children who were too young to remember the event were told stories by their parents about how ships arrived like angels made of steel and light. They grew up learning that compassion wasn't just an idea. It was something real, something that could cross oceans. Months turned into years, but the memory of the fleet never faded. Documentaries were made, books were written, and schools began teaching about the event as an example of what global unity could achieve. It wasn't remembered as a story of tragedy, but as a story of awakening, the moment humanity remembered what it was capable of when it stood together. Those who had once served in the mission often spoke about how it changed them. Soldiers who had been trained for war said it was the first time they had truly fought for life, instead of survival. Doctors who treated the injured said it reminded them why they took their oaths in the first place. Pilots who flew through storms carrying food and medicine said it was the proudest flight of their lives. In the months that followed the rebuilding, the islanders began to help others. They sent volunteers to other countries hit by disasters, saying it was their turn to give back. When a flood struck another coastal region years later, a ship from the island was one of the first to arrive with supplies. The cycle of compassion that had saved them continued outward, touching countless lives. The world watched and learned. Before that event, nations had often acted alone, competing or arguing over politics and borders. But the fleet had changed something deep in the world's heart. Governments realized that cooperation was not just possible, it was powerful. It saved lives, built trust, and reminded people that they were all part of one species, one family. The event became a turning point in how the world responded to crises. A new global task force was created, dedicated to emergency relief. It brought together ships, planes, and experts from dozens of countries, always ready to act when disaster struck anywhere on the planet. The fleet had proven that borders were small things compared to the strength of shared humanity. Back on the island, the people continued to thrive. Every year, on the anniversary of the disaster, a ceremony was held at the harbor memorial. Survivors, rescuers, and children gathered together, holding candles as the sun set over the water. The ocean that had once brought destruction now reflected the golden light of hope. An old fisherman, who had lost everything during the disaster, but lived to see the rebuilding, often said to visitors, "When the sea took my home, I thought we were forgotten. But then the world came, and I learned that humanity is the greatest ship of all. It sails through every storm." That saying became famous, written on posters and shared across social media. People everywhere were reminded of that truth whenever another disaster struck. Because of that one event, help came faster, cooperation grew stronger, and empathy became a global force again. Years later, historians would describe the moment the fleet arrived as the rebirth of human unity. For decades, the world had been divided by conflicts, politics, and greed. But the call for help from one small island had cut through all of that noise. It had reminded people that deep down, kindness was stronger than indifference, and compassion was more powerful than any weapon. And so, the story lived on. Not just in books or memorials, but in the hearts of those who remembered. Parents told their children how humanity once became one family. Teachers shared it with students to show that courage and kindness can change the course of history. The ocean waves continued to hit the shore, whispering softly against the rocks near the memorial. Visitors often said that if you listened closely, you could almost hear the distant hum of ships, a ghostly echo of the fleet that came when hope was nearly gone. The words on the plaque remained untouched, shining under the salt wind and sun. When we cried for help, the world came. The SOS was answered, humanity sent the fleet. And perhaps in that story, humanity found something even greater than survival. It rediscovered its heart. Because sometimes saving one island isn't just about rebuilding a nation, it's about rebuilding faith in what it means to be human.